What's up, Serpa Squad? Tanner here, and in this one we'll take an updated look at most of my terrariums. I want to show you a few updates, do some spring maintenance on ones that need it, and even go over a few that failed. First up is the terrarium I made in the long form, no voiceover presentation. At 1 month old, this one is doing really well. As you can see, there's minimal die-off from acclimation, the cryptanthus is getting some nice red to it, a vast root system is taking hold in the substrate, and the microfauna are thriving. Even though it is doing really well, I want to trim a few of the struggling sections of the ferns. In a terrarium, ferns will typically show some amount of acclimation die-off because they're fairly sensitive to changes in their environment. After this period of time though, they often do really well. Using my tools, I went through and spruced up the foliage. Not only will this make the terrarium look better, but it will allow the plant to focus more energy on making new, acclimated growth. The Alternanthera are also doing well, but like the ferns, they had a few unsightly leaves that needed brushed off. After a little maintenance, I ended up with this pile of trimmings. These were put to good use and hidden in the back of the terrarium as a food source for the microfauna. I don't always do that, but a healthy population of critters will typically make quick work of it and transform it into nutrients for the plants. The leaf litter and botanicals, although primarily for aesthetics in this one, will also serve the same function over time. Like usual, since I had this open for a little while, I added some water back into the system. I also took a moment to clean the inside of the glass with the microfiber cloth. 1 month later and completely maintained, this one is ready for the long haul. It has easily become one of my favorites and there's more that I could say about it, but it's time to take a look at another. Up next is the 5-gallon jumbo terrarium. I haven't showed this one in quite a while, but it's doing pretty well. That said, let's get into it and do some maintenance. The first thing that I did was clean the glass. Although this removed a lot of the condensation, that's not why I did it. Like all of my terrariums, I wiped the glass to keep it clear of debris. I also removed a few segments of dead syngonium that became an eyesore. Even at this moment, I really like how the terrarium looks, but I've been thinking for a while that I just have to add some additional hardscape. So I pulled out my bin of driftwood and used a few sections of manzanita wood to elevate the look of this terrarium. I've always liked this one for the simplicity of the layout and the size of the jar, but I think it looks even better with the additional elements. What do you think? Now we'll take a look at the levitating mossarium. For the sake of this video, I'm not going to make it levitate, but I'll link up the build video if you want to see that. It's a perfect example of why it's super beneficial to trim terrariums, and that's exactly what I'm doing here. Sure, everything is doing well and the terrarium is healthy, but had I let this go on for too long, it likely would have got so tangled that very little light could pass into the container and the plants would have choked each other out. Most likely this would have ended the terrarium altogether. Naturally, I don't want that to happen, so I cut the lawn and got the terrarium looking fresh and clean. Sure, just like my hair, I like it when it's grown in a little bit more, but it never hurts to trim it down like this. In fact, doing so will also help you get denser growth over time. As an added bonus, there's a good handful of moss trimmings here that I can use in other projects. Once trimmed, I gave the terrarium a good spray, cleaned the lid, and sealed it up. And there you have it. Now this one is ready for the months ahead. Next up is the Florence Flask Mossarium. This one is a perfect example of what I was talking about previously. It's slightly more overgrown and the mosses are starting to choke each other out. I know that this is the case just by looking at the plants, but there's also some patches of mold and the undergrowth is starting to suffer. Like the others, I opened it up, gave the mossarium a good trim, and manually removed the mold with my tweezers. It's worth mentioning that molding most often occurs in new terrariums that are gaining equilibrium, but it can also occur in established ones like this. If you manually remove it, that should help it from spreading and allow the terrarium to balance itself out quicker. Springtails will also help minimize this from happening in the first place and provide other benefits, as I've discussed in previous videos. Anyways, after all of that, I ended up with the second handful of moss. Another issue with this terrarium is the glass. It's covered in moss spores and debris that are ruining the visibility and hindering light from passing into the container. Like I always say, at the very least I highly recommend cleaning the glass of your container even if you're against doing maintenance on terrariums. Might not look like much, but here's all of the gunk that was on the inside of the glass. After carefully cleaning it, I sprayed some water into the container. Like usual, moisture was lost during maintenance, so we'll add it back. I'm also using the water to my advantage to further clean the glass. From there, I corked up the flask and cleaned the exterior with a microfiber cloth. And here's how it looks now. It's like night and day from how it previously looked. Again, this is a perfect example of why maintenance greatly aids in the success of your terrarium. Now let's freshen up the tiny terrariums. All of the tiny terrariums are still alive, but they're not thriving quite like the ones you just saw. As you would expect, something this small is really impractical, and unless you're up for doing very frequent maintenance, then they end up looking like this. Like my other terrariums, I only maintain these about 1 to 2 times a year, but they probably should be taken care of monthly. They're just so small that they quickly become overgrown, which causes problems as I explained earlier. Even though these are so small, as you saw, maintenance really isn't much different from the others. I opened them up, removed excess growth, cleaned the glass, added a few drops of water, and of course sealed them back up. I did this for all of them until I got to the one attached to a rock and the mini detailed terrarium. Both of these are pretty dried up and they don't need anything other than some water. I know that neither of them are gone completely because the moss does look alive, it's just a little dry. Trust me, these plants are really hardy and they can be resuscitated quite easily from a myriad of bad conditions. Regardless, now that all of the tiny terrariums are addressed, they should be ready for the future. Next, we'll move on to some terrariums that I don't do much with in this video, but I still wanted to show them. First is the terrarium that I made out in the woods. To this day, I haven't done any maintenance on this one whatsoever, and it's still doing really well. In fact, the isopods still call this place home. The terrarium in a terrarium's terrarium, on the other hand, is a peculiar subject. As you can see, the main terrarium isn't doing so well, but all of the terrariums inside of this one appear to be doing really well. I would have expected the opposite, to be honest, but upon closer inspection, it all makes sense. The cork on this one doesn't fit that well, so I'm not surprised that over time it just got dried out. However, I think most of the moss will come back if I can keep the setup well hydrated moving forward. In doing so, I proceeded to water both terrariums. During this process, I noticed that the springtail population had survived through the drought. Unfortunately, I can't say the same for the other critters. Maybe once we get this in a good position down the road, we'll add some more. Like I said a moment ago, I also watered the wild terrarium. Clearly it's thriving, but it looked like it was starting to dry up some, so I wanted to address it now before it got ahead of me. Now we'll move on to some failed terrariums and a few that I want to redo. Here's the bottle terrarium that I did for the closed terrarium basics video. Clearly it's not doing so well, but it is still alive. There are a few plants showing green, and I do believe that this Laginella is still alive despite it mostly being a pale green color, but I'm not totally sold on this setup. I could let it sit and see if it eventually comes back, but I've never been too crazy about this one if I'm gonna be honest. I think what I'll do is keep the foundation but rescape it and add some new plants down the road. I don't see a point in starting over from scratch again if the foundation is all there. What about the no opening terrarium though? Well, as you can see, this one was another failed attempt. I'm honestly surprised that it didn't work out this time because of how well it was doing for the first few months. I'm not quite sure what happened this time around, but clearly there's some nastiness going on in there. All that I know is that it looked really good whenever I last showed all of my terrariums in the same video, and then I bought a house. During that period I hardly looked at my terrariums, and a few months later when it was time to move, it was pretty much long gone. I'm absolutely determined to make this one work, and I think that the third time is going to be a charm. And on to another one that I don't show very often, the chambered terrarium. Some of these are doing well and some are dried up. Overall though, I'd say that surprisingly the majority are doing well. However, this is definitely one that I want to redo. I think I could do a much better job with this nowadays and really want to do something even crazier. The last one for this segment is going to be the ship in a bottle terrarium. I've talked about this in other videos, but this is another one that I really want to redo. Again, I think I could have done a much better job with it, plus I have some cool ideas that will really go along with the name. Regardless, there is still some life in this one, but it's not doing that great because I stopped maintaining it. No point in keeping up with it if I'm soon to dismantle it. The last one that I'm really going to showcase is the Venus Fly Trap Terrarium. I know that a lot of you have been patiently waiting for this update, but I was good on my word. I said I wasn't going to show this again until spring, and now it's spring. Before you go and get all upset with how it looks, understand what it's been through. Like I said in the build video, this terrarium had to go through dormancy in the winter. As such, it's been sitting in my garage for the past few months in the freezing cold. Because of this, most of the plants are still in dormancy and nothing looks too great. Now that spring's here, we can get this thing going again. To get it ready for the months ahead, I trimmed as much of the dead and dried up sections of the plants I could get, including the moss. As I've said countless times before, this will help stimulate new growth and freshen things up. Something pretty cool that I noticed during this process is that there are actually a few new fly traps starting to emerge. They're super tiny right now, and I mean really tiny. Despite their size now, they should grow up and be those nice traps that we all know and love. From there I gave the terrarium a good spray down with distilled water. In doing so I mostly targeted the moss since this container will retain some amount of humidity. Lastly, I cleaned the interior and exterior of the container. And there you have it, the updated look at the Venus Fly Trap Terrarium. Again, I know it's not much to look at right now, but in a few months it should be packed with plants once more. Time to put it back on the shelf where it belongs. To conclude, I know that a lot of people dislike the fact that I do maintenance on my terrariums, but this is art for me. I can't keep my art looking pristine and how I want it to look without caring for it. You definitely can have success quite easily without doing it, but you're not going to have something that looks like most of these. Even though it's not required, a lot of common problems such as mold can easily be eliminated to ensure that your terrarium succeeds just by doing a little bit of work. I'll definitely do a more thorough maintenance video in the future, but I hope this gave you a better idea of how I keep these terrariums looking their best. On a side note, I only do this about 1 to 2 times a year, so it's not like I'm constantly messing around with them. Don't get the wrong idea, they most certainly can sustain themselves. I'm only stepping in for a moment to ensure they stay on the right track. One more thing, in case you want to see how I built any of these terrariums, I'll leave my terrarium build playlist linked up in the video description. I have a build video for all of the terrariums that you just saw that will walk you through the process step by step. And on that, I'm out of here. If you like terrariums and similar type of projects, be sure to subscribe and join the Serpa Squad today. I know what you're thinking, what else could he possibly do with terrariums? Trust me, I've only just scratched the surface of what's possible with this art form, so stay tuned. Also, if you like the video, please do me a favor and take a moment to give the video a thumbs up. Trust me, it really does help me out and I greatly appreciate it. To those of you who continue to support the channel, and to all of the newcomers, I thank you greatly. I'll see you next week, Serpa Squad. Peace.